Dr. Nasser, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. As I read your book, Iran's Grand Strategy, I noticed many references to Iran being alone in the world. Here are some examples from your book. Iran would be alone. Iranians felt vulnerable and alone, forgotten by the international community. On the side was the Islamic Republic, alone, truly alone. And it's really interesting that we're having this conversation now, even though we scheduled it several months ago in anticipation of the release of your book. And now Iran and Israel are at war, virtually at war now. Is this being alone a theme in your book? Because I noticed that it goes several decades even prior to the 1979 revolution.
Well, it goes even further back. So, it's a very interesting theme that you have picked. So there is certain fact about Iran being alone. And I refer to this great Iranian scholar who had a book called Iran and Its Loneliness. Abbas Eslami Nodushan. I cite him there. And he actually positions it very interestingly that Iran is unique by its culture, by its language, by its heritage, by all of these things. But the other side of being unique is also being alone. And I draw on this theme that there is a fundamental fact about Iran, which runs through the geostrategy or the strategic thinking of its leaders, whether it's Shah Ismail Safavi and the Safavid dynasty, or whether it's the Qajars, the Pahlavis, and today. And the fundamental fact of it is that Iran, particularly since the Safavid period onwards, is alone in this region because it is Persian-speaking, its culture is Persian, language is Persian, it's not Arab, it's not Turkic. And its religion, the way the Safavids put their imprint on Iran, is Shia, so it's not Sunni either. So it's a Persian Shia state in a sea of Arab/Turkic Sunnis. And even you hear this in the themes these days. I mean, let's say years ago, the Arabs say Iran has no business meddling in Arab affairs. Iran is meddling in Arab affairs, right? As if Iran doesn't belong to the region, as if it's some other foreign power doing it, right? So Iran is a minority in the region by virtue of its language and its culture. And what this has meant in terms of strategic thinking is Iran has no strategic depth in the Middle East, particularly in Middle East to the west of it, right? It's alone. Now, in the modern under the Islamic Republic, there is also loneliness that is caused by Islamic Republic's particular attitude towards the West and its neighbors and its desire to export its revolution. So maybe the architects of Iranian revolution thought that this being an Islamic revolution, it will embed Iran much more in the Middle East. That it sort of would make them the leader of the Muslim world, the leader of the Middle East. That's the way Khomeini saw it. But in reality, it didn't. It actually led the Arabs to join hands with America and later on with Israel to put a containment on Iran. And it led the Sunni Arabs to gradually see Iran's revolution as a Shia one. That was even though Iran denied that, but that it's all about sectarianism, especially after the Iraq War. But generally speaking, as this current crisis happens, Iran is alone again.
Yeah.
Iran is facing the United States and Israel alone. Europeans have washed their hands. They are cheering Israel. The Arab countries are silent. Yes, they're condemning with statements, or maybe they don't want war, but they're not coming to Iran's assistance. So Iran has no natural friends. Even Russia and China are not playing that role. So there is this historical sense of being alone in this region, and there is also a sort of loneliness that the Islamic Republic in particular has experienced. And I even give the example of the Iran-Iraq war, which is the first time Iran went into a heinous a horrendous 8-year war, during which Iraq received support from the rest of the Arab world, from the United States, from Europeans. Countries sold that weaponry, provided it support diplomatically in the United Nations, and Iran was left to its own devices. Now, you could say that this notion that Iran is unique because of its civilization, because of its history, language, accomplishments, etc., gives Iran ambitions to be a leader in the region. But in reality, it feels vulnerable in this region because of that sense of loneliness. Now, historically, you could say maybe under the Pahlavis, it relied on the United States and on relations with Europe, but the Islamic Republic doesn't have that either.
Doesn't have that at all. I want to segue, if I may, please, Dr. Nasr, this sense of being alone and vulnerable to something else. Another theme that I picked up. At first, I thought it's curious that you would really highlight this, but then it made more sense as I read your book more. Let me set the scene. It's October 1978, and Mr. Khomeini is in Paris. We don't need to get to the details of that. Our audience is welcome to read your book. It's on page 35. And as he's looking at a sort of a mantra, revolutionary mantra or mission of the Islamic Republic, which he adds a word to the following two words. One is Islamic Republic, freedom, and he handwrites the word independence. And I find that really interesting because if you go back, you mentioned Safavids. So let's go back all the way to the Safavids. Iran is one of the only handful non-Western nations in the world that wasn't outright colonized, right? If you look at all around Iran, everybody was colonized to some extent. So if that's the case, that independence that Mr. Khomeini handwrote, and it's you hear it in the streets of Iran. I remember it as a child when I lived in Iran before the revolution, during the revolution. That independence must mean something else in Iran's history, right?
No, you're right. Well, it's nuanced. I mean, first of all, I think I'm glad you raised that issue because it's one of the themes of the book. In other words, we think of Iran as a theocracy driven by Islamic ideology.
Yeah.
But even from the very beginning, I think in Khomeini's mind, one of the most important things about Iran, about the revolution, was that it would give Iran genuine independence. That Islamic
What does
State
that mean, though, genuine independence?
Well, I think Iran has a history. History is fact, but the reality is that history is interpreted also. And particularly the Khomeini and Khamenei and the revolution as a whole, I think read Iran's history as if for 2 centuries it has not been genuinely independent. In other words, from the Qajar period, which is in the middle of the 19th century, with the advent of imperialism, Iran was not genuinely independent. Yes, it was not colonized. Yes, it had a nominal monarchy, but imperialism rather than colonialism basically sapped Iran of its true sovereignty. It had nominal sovereignty, but the Russians took territory in the north. The British took Bahrain from Iran. They had troops all over the place. They decided what happened. They bullied the king to issue decrees, give him concessions, etc. So to them, the Qajars had essentially lost true independence. Although here the independence is not technical in the sense that they're a sovereign state, but it meant that they basically were not free agents. Then come the Pahlavis, and obviously the revolutionaries imagined that the Pahlavis were American puppets or British puppets. So this is a myth that the revolution has perpetuated, that Reza Shah, the first Pahlavi monarch, was brought to power by the British.
And then his son, because of the coup d'etat, was...
Right. But both of these are historically problematic assertions because this was a story that was foisted Reza Shah largely by communists to delegitimate him. It's true that when he took over Iran, he staged a coup, he was encouraged or maybe supported by the British because the British decided that they didn't want Iran to divide. They were afraid of Bolshevism in Soviet Union. They wanted a unified Iran. But it doesn't mean that Reza Shah was like a 10 feet long screwdriver that the British were just twisting Iran. He was a free agent. But the myth became that okay, he's a British agent. Then the British, Russians, and Americans occupy Iran during World War II, and then they put the Shah, the Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Shah, on the throne. And then the interpretation of the revolutionaries is that the coup of 1953 was completely engineered in Washington and London, which I show in the book is actually, first of all, historically not accurate. Yes, they supported it, but who was the agent and who was the supporter is not as clear cut. So then the entire monarchy from 1953 to 1979, regardless of what it achieved, what it did for Iran, universities it built, roads it built, all of it basically is meaningless. So in Khomeini's imagination, Iran's history from mid-19th century to 1979 is the history of a country that is struggling to be independent, struggling against British and the Russians, struggling against the Soviets when they occupied Iranian territory, and then struggling against the British and the Americans during the Pahlavi period. The struggle is being carried out by people like Khomeini who are opposing the Pahlavis. So to Khomeini, the Iranian revolution, yes, it was Islamic. Yes, it was many things. It produced the opposite, but the most important thing he gave Iran was independence. So when this is the secular person I mentioned who goes to Paris with a manifesto that he thinks would be acceptable to Khomeini as a manifesto of the revolution. So the future government of Iran shall be Islamic and democratic. Democracy because us secularists want it, Islam because what you want it. Khomeini adds a third criteria that he would be independent. And I cite in the book a Pakistani journalist who's now actually a very prominent politician in Pakistan, went to Tehran to cover the revolution and had a meeting with Khomeini and asked him, okay, what's different in Tehran now? What's the big deal about your revolution? And Khomeini says, now all decisions will be made in Tehran. Right? And so to him, this factor of independence was extremely important. And this is embedded in the mindset of this Islamic Republic. Right. So when the supreme leader refuses to give up the right to enrichment, which was the case, a recent story before the attack, largely was about many Iranians said it's about energy independence. We don't want to rely on our fuel on foreigners. It's our inherent right. It's a mark of our independence that we make our own decisions. Or when he answered President Trump's ultimatum that you have to give up enrichment, he said, who the hell are you to tell Iran what to do?
It's right? Independence and defiance.
Well, you defy to get your independence. That's what the revolution was.
The
revolution in Khomeini's mind, in Khamenei's mind, defied the international system and America's desire to subjugate Iran. So Iran is continuously on an ongoing basis fighting for its independence. I know it sounds cliche, but you have to sort of understand that this is a bedrock of the way they think about Iran, that everything Iran is doing is to ensure its independence against an Iraqi invasion, taking hostages at the American embassy and closing their embassy, which is to ensure independence against another American coup in Iran, protecting their position in Syria, Iraq, etc., to ensure Iran's independence. So, and even when the supreme leader says that we're going to develop our economy without the West. We have this resistance economy, which means development despite relations with the West.
And you and I discussed that regarding your sanctions book last year.
Yes.
And that was actually a big internal discussion within Iran's government. Okay.
Yeah, but all of it to them is that if you were to ask what is the biggest accomplishment in their own mind of this regime, is that they have given Iran the independence that it always wanted. They've given them what Mossadegh wanted to achieve and couldn't. And most recently, Iran's former foreign minister and vice president, Javad Zarif, said that we're the only government in several hundred years of Iran's history that has not lost its territory and protected the territorial integrity and independence of the country.
Wow.
It's an outlandish claim that I would, or many historians would have issue with based on fact and interpretation. But I think what makes it interesting is that these arguments are not about religion. It's not about what the Quran says. It's not about Shia theology. It's that the fundamental, mindset that they're trapped in is around this particular reading of Iranian history, which is this grievance against the country that has felt vulnerable, humiliated, and has felt that it hasn't had full independence, that exploded on the scene in the form of the Iranian Revolution, and now is become a shackle around the necks of the Islamic Republic, which is pushing them down rabbit holes from which they cannot extricate themselves.
I have two comments to make about that, Dr. Nasr. One is what you're describing. There's nothing Islamic about it. That sounds nationalistic. Right.
Well, it's a particular reading of nationalism because the Shah was also very nationalistic.
Yeah.
The Shah also had a vision of how he would secure Iran's independence. And he believed that Iran would be independent and secure if it was economically strong. And Iran would be independent and secure if it would maneuver the United States to do its bidding.
Yeah.
We have a Soviet threat, he thought, that the issue is not oil and that sort of independence. The issue is territorial independence, and you need the United States. So the Shah, despite what Khomeini may think about the Shah or the revolution may say about the Shah was also nationalistic. But what sort of nationalism are we talking about? What interpretation of nationalism? What are you defining independence to be, and how are you going to achieve it? So I think that there are times that the Islamic Republic or the Islamic Revolution is all about Islam and is all about nationalism and independence. But I think there is a level at which what Khomeini meant is that secularism, Marxism, liberalism cannot give you real independence. Only Islam can give you real independence.
Okay. Islam as
So
a
it's
way.
not you're not being independent to be Islamic, but rather that you cannot be independent without being Islamic.
In Khomeini's eyes and his followers, his successors, Islam facilitates independence for Iran.
Facilitates and guarantees it.
Yeah.
Right. That's the power of Islam.
My second
in
comment
this world.
In this world. My second comment, Dr. Nasr, was about something you said. I think maybe it was the current leader, Mr. Khamenei, who says, who the heck is America to tell us what to do? I remember from my childhood, again, before my family and I left Iran, days of revolution, there's a famous saying by Mr. Khomeini, the first leader, something like that. He says something to the effect that America doesn't have the right to tell us what to do, or America can't do a damn thing. I think something to that effect. Yeah, I'm translating it. So my comment is this. As I read your book, something at first really confused me, but then sort of realization began to set in that, are you suggesting that anti-Americanism, Iran's anti-Americanism, became embedded in policy setting, became sort of, you use the phrase sacred defense and national security? So it wasn't just a emotional knee-jerk reaction. After a while, it actually became part of the Iranian government's system of securing its independence. Am I reading this correctly?
No, you're right. Not only anti-Americanism, but actually Islamic ideology itself, because each for a different reason. I think, the entire hostage crisis episode ended up in a situation where the revolution asserted its independence and power by being anti-American. And it drilled into the population. So for 444 days, it refused to give in to the United States. Every day there was a throng of people who came in front of the American embassy and chanted the most outrageous anti-American things. And it almost like anti-Americanism became sort of part of the doctrine, part of the worldview of the Islamic Republic, from which they really couldn't easily extricate themselves. It's became part of their language. Now, during the Iran-Iraq War, I think one of the lessons they learned later was that the reason they were able to fight that war alone was because there was a bond between the population and the revolutionary government, which was Islamic ideology. That they had a population that believed in the revolution, was willing to die for it, was willing to volunteer to give their lives in improbable battles and fight for the Islamic Republic, which in the eyes of the regime, the Islamic Republic was the guarantor of Iran's independence. And so I think there is the idea that why initially they referred to the warriors all the time as the imposed war, which is now the terminology is being used for referring
war.
to, Jang Tahmili, as they say.
This is 1980s Iran and Iraq. Okay.
Iran, which actually the same terminology is being now used in some quarters to refer to the Israeli attack. That is a war that's imposed on Iran. But then they began to use gradually the term sacred defense. So sacred defense means that there was a defense that was successful because they were able to repel Iraqis, but it was sacred because it was the power of belief that united the state and society and brought the people into defending Iran. I mean, the Supreme Leader a few years ago said during the war years, every village, every family, every corner of Iran was the strategic depth of the war. It was that the entire population was behind the war. So you could
kind
see
of like
that
whole of society preparing and fighting it out.
Right.
Okay.
So the way you could see is that gradually the security mindset, the fights they pick with the outside, the need that they have to defend themselves is almost necessitates ideology. I don't think it's like ideology gets them to fight America or to fight Israel. It's rather than because they're fighting America or Israel or Saudis, etc., they feel like they need that ideology because that's what worked during the Iran-Iraq War. Right? It's a formula that it was the recipe, the formula that was successful during Iran-Iraq War that they want to keep reflected. I give an anecdote in the book that when the Mahsa Amini protests happened, there's this senior representative of the Supreme Leader in the city of Mashhad, a very powerful cleric, very hardline, powerful cleric. He said something to the effect that if we allowed society to go basically immoral, people don't wear a hijab, do whatever they want, where are we going to find the pious youth who are going to defend this country?
Wow.
It was a national security argument. It was not about the Quran says you should be wearing this. I mean,
where are we going to find? Yeah, where are we going to find all the volunteers that volunteered in the 1980s, gave their lives and belonged? I'm sorry, you were going to say knee-jerk reaction.
So the magic recipe that worked, which you could call it sacred defense, the magic recipe that worked, that you have a highly ideologically committed religious population that is willing to do the sacrifices they did in the 1980s, which guaranteed Iran's independence, which allowed Iran to repel Iraqi invasion, which the Iranians, by the way, believed the United States was behind it. That population is disappearing.
Yeah.
Right before the eyes of the Islamic Republic. So the Mahsa Amini protest is the point where you can see is they realize that sacred defense is no longer possible, and those who are resisting giving up on hijab, like this Ayatollah, are not saying that we should defend hijab in the name of religion. They're saying we should defend hijab because we need sacred defense, because we still have to defend.
Yeah.
Right. Our wars are not over.
Is that sense of Islamic piety, in their eyes anyway, that revs up people to fight for Iran? That's where it comes down to.
That's right.
Let's get to your book. Its title, it's really important. When I saw it first, and it's true to its title, it really lays out Iran's grand strategy sort of in military terms. So did Iran have a grand strategy? Let's going back to the foundation of the Pahlavi and coming to the second monarch of the Pahlavis.
Yes, I mean, sometimes it wasn't called that. So I mean, but grand strategy is a term we can refer to. What is the big agenda that a state puts before itself? You can look in modern times and say, when Deng Xiaoping came to China, for him, the grand strategy was China's development into a world power. So then you organize the rest of the resources of the state around those aims. Now, for the Pahlavis, particularly for the first Pahlavi, Iran's grand strategy was actually national survival. I mean, Reza Shah took over at the time when Iran was disintegrating, was being maybe divided. There was no central government. You have warlords or local governors, etc., all over the country. There was no law and order. It kind of looked like Afghanistan after 20 years of civil war. And so the big idea for the country was to survive, right? And this basically meant it needed an army, it needed education, it needed industrialization, it needed development. So essentially, he organized everything around society around achieving national integration. And he was highly successful. Maybe he was not successful as a political leader, although he never fell from power. He was removed from power by the British. But he built the new state in Iran, which is still there. Universities, healthcare system, roads, railways, first industries, national identity around Iranianness, language, educational system, all of these things, right? Under the second Pahlavi monarch, the idea was, again, built around economic development. So both of them had a view of Iran's national ambitions and how does Iran protect itself, gain its national interest in terms of economic might, each with a different way. I mean, in some ways, you could look at a country like Saudi Arabia and say, what MBS is doing in Saudi Arabia is very Pahlavi-esque.
Economic might.
Economic might, but in fact, sometimes it's more Reza Shah because he actually is trying to change the country, forcibly secularize it, break down, consolidate power, etc. But he has a great vision there. Saudi Arabia is going to be a world power by X years. It's going to be strong. It's going to have this. So there is a national ambition. You say, what's the purpose of national ambition? Is it addresses national interests, but it also addresses national security issues for the country. So under the Pahlavis, Iran sought security, not just by having a military or alliances with the United States. It sought security in terms of being economically strong, being a modern nation state. I mean, Reza Shah's sort of argument was that you have to first have a state before you have a country. Or let me put it this way, in order to preserve this country or have a country, you have to have a state. So he understood the state in terms that people understood it then, which is the French Third Republic or the Kemalist state next door. Yeah. You have to have a powerful military, powerful bureaucracy. It's top down, it's centralized. You have to have universal education. Everybody has to dress in a Western way. You change culture, you change all of these things. You give healthcare system, high school system, university, I mean, all of the things. And he basically got all of these things without any support from the outside. So you have to give him his due. Yeah, there would not have been an Iran today if it wasn't for Reza Shah.
And many Iranians revere him to this day.
No, they should. They should. I mean, no leader is perfect. I mean, when I worked in the U.S. government, we worked in Afghanistan. This was then Iraq had happened. It dawned on me that the Americans are desperately looking for Reza Shah in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's what they were looking for. And they never found him. Yeah. It is. I mean, this man arrived in Iran when Iran looked like Afghanistan. There was no billions of dollars, no UN, no American troops, no outside support, nothing.
Well, that is
and
such
yet he kept the country together. I mean, and yes, he deserves to be. He deserves to be get his due. And then his son basically built on that. In other words, the Shah had a view that Iran's biggest challenge is actually to survive the Soviet Union.
I see.
Because when he became Shah, he was a 20-year-old young man, and his first learning experience was that he had to deal with Soviet occupation of northern Iran, and the capital city was under the hands of the British, Russian, and American troops. The country didn't have independence, and it may lose its northern part. So for him, this phobia of Iran being divided, and particularly being occupied by its northern neighbor, basically meant that the first article for of national security for Iran was territorial integrity. And that required, in his mind, two things: economic development and close alliance with the United States. Why? Because it was Truman that saved Azerbaijan and Kurdistan from Russians eating it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and it's not that America needed Iran the way Khomeini thinks. It's Iran that needed America.
Forced
And the Shah
independence.
thought, and the Shah thought that Mossadegh got it wrong. You know, the fight between Mossadegh and the Shah, later on, everybody thought it was about democracy versus monarchy. It wasn't. The Shah was not then an absolute. It was not. That's not how it started. The fight didn't start over there. In fact, the Shah was very popular with the people. He was a constitutional monarch. And the fight started not over democracy. The fight started over the fact that Mossadegh said, the Soviet threat doesn't matter. Iran's biggest threat are the British and imperialism and the oil. And the Shah said, yeah, they are bad. They are, but we have a bear growling at the door, which only 10 years ago was eating us up. You're creating distance with the British and American. You're alienating them, and you're creating a situation in which the Russians may take over. And in the end, I argue in the book that Mossadegh's failure was that his strategy was wrong. And Mossadegh thought that if he threatened America with communism, they will abandon the British and force the British to come to the table. And it's not that's why I think it's not true that the Americans did the coup, because there were enough Iranians who were not convinced with Mossadegh's strategy. This included the Shah, Iranian military, senior Iranian politicians who broke with Mossadegh, and then also the most senior Iranian Ayatollahs, the versions of Ayatollah Sistani, Ayatollah Burujerdi, Ayatollah Behbahani. They weren't a fan of the Shah or secularism in Iran. They hated what the Pahlavis stood for, but they also understood that Mossadegh's strategy is wrong-headed. I argue that there's many ways to look at the Shah-Mossadegh debate, but one way you should look at it, it was a debate of two different visions of Iran's grand strategy. What is the biggest threat to Iran, and how do you organize yourself against that threat? The Shah and Iranian military and grand Ayatollahs and segment of the elite believe that as bad as the British are, as nasty as imperialism is, the bigger threat to Iran is the Soviet Union, and you need to stay close to the West. And Mossadegh basically was willing to play broke with Iran's alliance with the US and the West in order to get Iran's oil back. And in some ways, I argue in the book that the Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's current foreign policy of resistance, these are the real intellectual heirs of Mossadegh. So, because Mossadegh was not just about democracy. Mossadegh's main argument was not democracy at the beginning. Mossadegh's main argument was that this is our national right, and we will accept any kind of outside pressure to have our national right. It's an argument of principle. But in the end, the strategy behind it was not convincing, and Mossadegh failed. Then, but as I said, the Shah's regime was never able to convince the Iranian public of his own grand strategy. Yeah. Look, I would say for Iranians to understand, look at Saudis and MBS, or the West and MBS. He's a dictator, but he's convinced his people that I'm going to do good for you. I'm going to make Saudi Arabia the world's one of the G7 countries. I'm going to do all of these things. When the Shah would say, I'm going to make Iran one of the top 5 industrial producers by year 2000, Iranians laughed at them.
Laughed at him.
Laughed at him. What grandiosity, what,
pomposity.
How dare you think, pomposity. Wow. But basically, the Shah failed where MBS has succeeded, which is to convince the Iranian population of the wisdom of what he wanted to do. Yeah, and yes, he was a dictator. Yes, there was Savak. Yes, he angered a lot of people, but he did have a grand strategy. the grand strategy was to secure Iran through economic development in collaboration with the West, and that the Iran that would be strong and powerful would then be secure in the Middle East and against the Soviet Union, and an Iran that was allied with the United States could get the resources and military and diplomatic support to achieve these goals. So the Shah never saw himself as a tool of the United States. He saw the United States as a tool of his agenda.
Interesting. And that's not how the revolutionaries in 1979 portrayed the Shah.
No, actually, that's why I told you that Iran has a history that we historians can go and debate the facts, etc. But history is always interpreted.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is a particular interpretation of those events that led Khomeini and Khamenei down a different path. And what's very interesting, as we're speaking about there, that in Iran there is revisionism. That's why the Pahlavis are popular again.
Yeah.
Because there is now sort of a understanding that the judgment that's been handed down, not only it's not fair, it's not accurate. That yes, you can criticize them for many things, excesses, authoritarianism, bad judgment, whatever. But you cannot question the fact that the Shah had a vision, and that vision is right now more attractive to Iranians than it was in 1979.
Yeah. Dr. Nasr, did the Shah have a Shiite sort of strategy? You mentioned something, and I may be butchering the words here, so help me out, please. The green belt or the green
plan? The green plan.
What was that? Could you explain that, please?
Well, I mean, this I actually really owe to a Iranian academic, Arash Raisizadeh, who was a professor at Tehran University. Now he was expelled from the university after the Mahsa Amini protest, and he's a fellow at Harvard right now. But he dug into the archives of Sabak that were published after the revolution. And he particularly identified what are sort of continuities between the way the Islamic Republic thinks about the Arab world and the way the Shah began to think about the Arab world. And his argument is not that different from the one I'm making, that there's certain facts about Iran. So the Shah, in his early years of his life, monarchy, he was threatened by the Arab world, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ba'athist in Iraq, etc. But then in the 1970s, the tide turned. First of all, Nasser gave place to Sadat, and the Shah became very close to Anwar Sadat. Yeah, and the Shah was very important in convincing Washington to take Sadat very seriously. Then the Shah very cleverly used the Kurds in Iraq to force Saddam Hussein to come to table and sign the Algiers Accords with Iran and basically accept Iran's terms to end hostilities with Iran. And in that, Raisizadeh also shows that the Shah basically began meddling in the Arab world. I mean, he began interfering by organizing the Kurds in essentially a rebellion that threatened to break up an Arab country. Then the Shah convinced Nixon that he should anoint Iran as the policeman of the Persian Gulf. I mean, basically, America was exhausted with the Vietnam War. He didn't want to do it. He came and told them, look, let me protect you. There's a professor at LS London School of Economics, Roham Alvandi, who's written extensively on this. Yeah. That ultimately that led to a deal that, okay, we recognize the sovereignty of Bahrain, we protect, we guarantee protection of the Gulf countries. You give us all the weapons, Navy we want, we pay for it with higher oil prices, and Iran essentially is something that actually the Islamic Republic really would like to be made the policeman of the Gulf. But they're actually organizing opposition against them, whereas the Shah found a way to get the Americans to give it to him on a silver platter. And then like he intervened in Oman to put down an insurgency, literally put Iranian troops on the ground to do the kind of things these days Americans do. And he began to understand that, if Iran is going to be a great power in the Middle East, it has to be present in the Arab world. And he began to give money to Imam Musa Sadr in Lebanon, who was an Iranian cleric who
the Shah did this.
The Shah did this. The Shah gave him money. It's again all documented in Sabak archives in Raisizadeh's book. that and this was called the Green Plan. And in fact, there is a quote there by a Colonel Isa Pejman, who was head of SAVAK's Middle East Bureau, which says that in order not to have to defend ourselves on our borders, we have to defend ourselves on the Mediterranean. It could be words that could be coming out of General Soleimani's mouth.
The Islamic Republic, yeah.
Right. And in fact, and I cited in the book, the Shah was becoming more and more pro-Arab in the Israeli issues. Like he told an American ambassador that unless you force Israel to make peace with Egypt, if there is another war in the Middle East, we will have to join on the side of the Arabs. Yeah, maybe an idle threat, but he just told you how much things were tilting. So there is certain realities here now, which is if Iran is to break out of its loneliness in the region, if it's going to participate in the region, if it's going to protect its interests in the region, it has to protect them inside the Arab world. The Shah did it through alliances, but he was not averse to meddling in Oman, meddling in Iraq, giving money to Imam Musa. And the Islamic Republic is also doing it in its own ways. Well, obviously, the way Islamic Republic does it
is
in the environment that is backfires. Whereas Iran was much more, there was much more reception to its participation.
Is the way.
And also, let me add one other thing, because this is also important.
Please.
The alliance between Iran and Syria was established by the Shah in the 1970s. That's how old it is. And it was established around the fact that your enemy's enemy is your friend. This was before Iran normalized with Syria. So the Syrians, even though they were Baathists, their biggest enemy was in the Arab world was Saddam Hussein and Iraqi Baathists. And Iraqi Baathists were also threatening Iran. So the Islamic Republic did not create the alliance with the Assad family. It continued the alliance with the Assad family.
Wow. The more you share with us, the more I think I and our audience begin to realize that this is a continuation. This grand strategy is a continuation from the late Pahlavi era.
Well, I would say, it's important to note that every regime in Iran, the Pahlavis, the Qajars, the Islamic Republic has devised its own definition of what the grand strategy is, what the goal is, and what are the mechanisms or strategies through which you achieve that goal. But there are certain fundamental realities that they're reacting to, right? Yeah. There are certain geographic and historical and cultural realities that are not changeable. And so the first thing to note is that these realities sometimes carry over time along the regimes. Secondly, is to note that the Shah, the Pahlavis did have grand strategies. They weren't just tools of the West or just allies of the West. They had similar sets of concerns, interests, ambitions, vulnerabilities that they were trying to address. But they approached it completely differently than the Islamic Republic. So there is this layer that we have to understand about why Iran behaves generally as a big state in the region the way it does. And then there is the level at which the particular strategies of regimes, have they succeeded or have they failed? And in the case of the Pahlavis, there's also sub-level strategies that we have. What was Mossadegh's strategy wise? I mean, his position was principled and correct, but did he have a workable strategy for Iran? There's a point at which, you have a battle of strategies. I say that repeats under Islamic Republic when Rafsanjani or Khatami or Rouhani are pushing for a different grand strategy for Iran.
More economically based.
It's an echo of the Pahlavi period.
Yeah.
Build your economy, be strong. That means make up with the United States.
Yeah.
Find a way to open up. The whole nuclear issue debate in Iran at some level is about, whether the Islamic Republic's grand strategy is working or not.
Dr. Nasr, in your book, you have a passage. It's very brief, in which you say that in the later years of the Iran-Iraq revolution, it may have been 1988 or 87, Mr. Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, is actually very receptive to opening negotiations with the United States.
No, he was open to basically dealing with the U.S. This becomes the Iran-Contra affair, which becomes a controversy for the Reagan administration, which is the U.S. approaches Iran with the idea that we can give you weapons or parts of weapons or certain missiles that you need in the war, and you pay us because they needed to give that money to Contras, which were these rebels that were fighting in Nicaragua against the Marxist government, but Congress had forbidden the government in the United States to support the guerrillas. So they basically wanted to pay the guerrillas with arms that they would sell to the Iranians, as opposed to through congressionally mandated budget.
I see. And so this is a dealing. This is not part of a grand strategy of making up with the U.S.
No. I mean, under Khomeini, Iran toyed with this. I mean, there are various episodes where they come very close to dealing in a way that could have been an opening. So this is one. Although what happens, the whole thing gets leaked in Iran, is published in a Lebanese newspaper. It becomes a massive embarrassment, and the whole thing falls apart. There are other times later on, like for instance, Iran helps the United States to topple the Taliban in 2001.
Yeah.
And then the President George Bush responds by putting Iran on the axis of evil list.
And you and I actually, in an earlier interview, I think it was back in 2023, we talked about how Iran reached out via a letter in 2003, and
that's right.
President Bush rejected it. That's in your other book. As you were talking about the Shah's government saying something to the effect that we rather fight in the Mediterranean to the west than on Iran's soil, this makes me think of another theme in your book, and that is forward defense. Are these similar? Forward defense is something that the IRI...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, forward defense is a strategy they stumble upon. I mean, first of all, even during the Iran-Iraq war, once they pushed the Iraqis out of Iran, a number of military commanders argue with Khomeini that Iran's border with Iraq is not really defensible because of the way it is. This is the border through which Alexander came. It's the border through which the Arabs came in the 7th century. It's the border through which Saddam came. And therefore, we need to basically capture Iraqi territory, be inside Iraq, in order to be able to protect our borders. And it is this argument that eventually convinces Khomeini to say, okay, now that we have pushed Saddam out, we need to pursue Saddam into Iraq, which causes the war to continue an additional 6 years. Iran doesn't succeed in the end to create a beachhead for itself in Iraq.
Yeah.
But this idea that we need to be outside of our borders to protect ourselves came out of Iran-Iraq war. Then Iranians, for varieties of reasons, end up helping the establishment of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, between 1982 and at least 2024, becomes a very powerful instrument in Iran's hands to prevent the kind of Israeli free hand to attack Iran that we're seeing today.
Yeah.
Because the presence of Hezbollah there always gave Israel pause that Iran could retaliate on its borders, wreak havoc, missiles, etc. So for at least 20 years, this idea worked. So how was Iran defending itself against Israel? I mean, just neutrally speaking, I'm not saying good, bad, terrorists, not terrorists, but neutrally. Why was Israel not attacking Iran in 2022, in 2003, in 2006, sooner? Because of presence of Hezbollah. So this became an idea. And then when the United States invaded Iraq, the US probably would have wanted to go from Iraq straight to Tehran. That's what they were saying then. And there's a lot of the documents I looked at that the Iranians basically took that very, very seriously. So setting up militias in Iraq basically became the way in which to make America busy there. Make sure they don't succeed in a way that then they would contemplate coming to Tehran. And these ideas basically gelled around this theme of forward defense, which basically means that we need to defend ourselves against the Arab world and against American use of the Arab world against us by being in the Arab world. Now, they were given opportunity. It's not like they went and conquered. So they got the opportunity in Lebanon because Israel invaded, Lebanon collapsed, there was a vacuum, and the Shia militias took over from where the Palestinians were. So that was a broken Lebanon was an opportunity. The United States invades Iraq, crushes its army, disbands it, destroys its government, frees the Shia. That's an opportunity. The Arab Spring batters Yemen and batters Syria. The central governments collapse, and Iran steps in. So the strategy became possible because of the collapse of various parts of the Arab world for varieties of reasons between 1982 and 2014. But it becomes this attractive idea, and gradually it becomes a very strong part of Iran's defense. That's exactly why that the collapse of Hezbollah and collapse of Syria is interpreted by Israel and America as the weakening of Iran. Why is Iran weaker? Because these forces are gone. Iran is weaker because its deterrence is gone.
Yeah, its forward defense is no longer working.
Its forward defense is gone. So Iran now has only its missiles to rely on, and that's a finite number, and there are limitations to what it can do with it.
Yeah.
So that's where forward defense fit in.
Yeah. Dr. Nasr, I'll close with this question. I hope it doesn't sound strange, but my question is this. For whom did you write this book? And for our audience, I want to qualify this question with the fact that I have read your prior books, such as The Dispensable Nation, I mentioned that earlier, and How Sanctions Work. This book is bigger, broader. Who's your audience for this book?
I mean, the audience could be educated public policymakers, as if they have the patience to read it, because I do think that as they're thinking about Iran or want to think about Iran, and as they're thinking about whether to go to war with Iran, whether threatening Ayatollah Khamenei with unconditional surrender, etc., works or not, you're playing a game of chess. You have to understand how the other side thinks. You don't need to approve, but you need to know where they're coming from. Just thinking that a bunch of woolly-brained mullahs with turban on their head may actually delude you. Just like thinking of the Shah as just a puppet of America, it deludes you if you think of him that way. So you actually have to take seriously, what are these guys' assumptions? Where do these assumptions come from? How do they interpret history, interpret facts? But at the same time, I have felt that this argument about where does national security thinking, national strategy fits in Iran's history is missing in the way we've approached Iran. So, great history of Iran have been written. There are social histories, political histories, there are histories of dynasties and governments. They examine domestic policies. There are great foreign policy histories of Iran. But we haven't thought about, looking at Iran's history from this angle. So I say at the preamble to the book that this is not a comprehensive history of Iran. And I'm not writing it through the angle of grand strategy thinking to the exclusion of all the other, social, economic, political factors that you could include or look at the Iran's history through those angles. But I just think that I'm hoping that this book would complement histories of Iran, at least modern Iran, in a way that we get a better picture, understand the continuities and changes. And then as I was writing this book, it was very clear to me that you can't even understand the Islamic Republic without understanding national security, because this is not a theocracy. This is a national security state.
Yeah.
Everything in this country is organized, yes, in the name of religion, but it's organized around national security. And so you have to look at it this way. And that's why I chose to publish it with a university press, with a rigor and the audience that it has. So it is not a book for this moment. I hope that it would contribute to the corpus of modern Iranian studies.
Well, it's a great book. I've read it cover to cover, and I encourage the audience to read it. I learned a great deal, Dr. Nasr, and as you know, I've read a lot of books about Iran. Dr. Nasr, thank you so much for educating me and our audience, and to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much.
Thanks for inviting me. It's
Sure.
great to be with you.